The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon. This is Sue Prentice on behalf of the National Association of State EMS Officials. You've joined us today for the Agency and Vehicle Licensure Committee's presentation or panel discussion on the Ambulance Remount Challenge. We're going to give it about 2 more minutes to get a maximum number of folks on the line. We have close to 100 participants today, and then we'll get started. For now, if we can just keep everybody on mute. Our panelists are already with us, and I'll introduce them when we get started. Thank you.
Rachel, are you there?
Yes.
Did we spell Coleman's name correctly on the slide?
That would probably be me, and I think we're missing an E.
Okay. It was staring at me, and I sorry. Folks won't notice, maybe.
Again, good afternoon. This is Sue Prentice on behalf of the National Association of State EMS Officials, Agency and Vehicle Licensure Committee. We'd like to, again, welcome you to our discussion this afternoon, our panel discussion on the Ambulance Remount Challenge. As many of you know, have joined us today, the conversation or the discussions around ambulance remounts in our industry. There's an intersection taking place with the federal motor vehicle safety standards, national ambulance design standards such as the NFPA 1917 and CAS GVS version 1.0. We're lucky today to have with us a group of subject matter experts who've been working on this issue on behalf of the EMS, on behalf of our nation of EMS, and this is going to be an overview of the issue, their efforts to date, and without further ado, I'd like to introduce the panel. Michael Berg, who's been with formerly from the Virginia EMS office and is a member of the Agency and Vehicle Licensure Committee. Coleman Sachs, who is with the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. Mark Van Arnam, who's going to speak with us about, he represents CAS GVS, and Ken Holland from the NFPA. For the purposes of this webinar today, I'd ask all our participants to stay on mute. Our panelists they'll proceed in order. The slides are being controlled at NHTSA headquarters, and if you have questions, we're going to try to hold those until the end. You can raise your hand, or you have a question key available to you. You can just put your question in writing, and again, at the end, I'd be happy to handle that. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Rachel and the panel.
Good morning. This is Michael Berg. Been serving as the chair of the Ambulance Vehicle Licensure Committee for the National Association of State EMS Officials for several years now. And one of the main areas that we've been working with is dealing with and participating with those organizations addressing standards for ambulances, both initial construction and with remounts. So our goal today, the objective of today's program is, as you see on your screen, to explore those challenges and potential solutions through national initiatives related to the establishment of standards related to remounts. This has become more of a discussion in the last couple of years among the organizations who've been working on ambulance standards. As we go forward, I want to put out one disclaimer so that you're aware. On the list of standards of the panelists, you do not see John McDonald, who is the administrator for the General Services Administration for the National Ambulance Standards, the KKK 1822 purchase standards for the federal government. The reason that he's not part of this panel discussion is that the federal government does not buy remounts. They do not purchase remounts. So it was not an oversight. It was intentional. John has been involved and continues to be involved with all the organizations that discuss the remount challenges. Next slide, please. So why is NHTSA involved? Why are we interested? Why do we put a lot of energy and time into working through this process? Prior to my coming on board as a member of NHTSA, the NHTSA was a voting member of NFPA 1917. In fact, Sue Prentice was one of the original members on that as a voting member for the representing NHTSA as the NFPA was developing ambulance standards for the future. As this process was evolving, NHTSA was very instrumental in seeking a TIA document with regards to several of the proposed aspects of 1917, with the thought process being that they were involved in the aspect, there were things that were being recommended. They wanted to challenge those or delay the implementation until such time information and research could be conducted. As the process further developed, then the CAS organization then established the Ground Vehicle Standards Work Group. NHTSA sat at the table. I was, along with Dia Gaynor, sat on that work group. We had several meetings developing the Ground Vehicle Standards version 1.0 that you are aware of now. We are also active participants from multiple organizations regarding current ambulance standards for new construction. I will say that as we were working through these, it became more apparent that the concern was, particularly when the SAE standards were developed and shared with regards to the cot retention systems, the new cot systems, and several of the other Society of Automotive Engineering standards that were based on science and research that were developed for the safety of the occupants of the ambulance as well as our patients, that there would be a concern there would be a large number of people who would avoid those new purchases of new ambulances by remounting their old ambulances, so there would be a cost savings. That was an active discussion among all the groups. Next slide, please. So again, why the remounts? Having been in this business for almost 40 years, I have been involved in both in the volunteer and the career side, as well as jurisdictional agencies. And now I'm with a hospital-based system. And for the record, we don't buy remounts. We all do original construction. But for those people who had tight budgets, it was felt that there was a cost savings to doing a remount system, taking the box, if you will, off of one chassis and putting it on the other. And again, the concern was it was cost savings. For those of us who've been in the industry for any length of time, although nobody will identify anybody in particular, we're all aware of those horror stories of the shade tree mechanic who would take a box with the chain over a tree branch, pull it off a truck, stick it in another chassis. And so these stories started to surface more and more, and we were concerned about how do we assure that if you are getting a remount ambulance, that the safety standards that are designed to protect the patients and the providers would in fact be utilized. Next slide, please. I can share with you, and I've been continually sharing, that in the Commonwealth of Virginia, in my role as the Regulation and Compliance Manager, we actually have a regulation that, back please, we actually have a regulation that specifically states that an ambulance must meet the current, in our regulations, we specifically identify the GSA 1822 purchase specifications. So we were challenged. One of my staff members, as a matter of fact, challenged and said, are we sure this applies to remounts? And when we talked to our Attorney General's office, because there was no language that specifically exempted remounts, then the ruling from our Attorney General's office, and we have stood by, is that when we put a permit on an ambulance, it meets the current safety standards. I think you will hear in a couple of the slides later in this presentation that if you take a toolbox off an old truck and put it on a new truck, that's just it. It's a new truck. And that was our position. It has met some opposition, but Virginia has been successful in maintaining that standard, and to the best of my knowledge is not going to deviate from that in future renditions of their regulations. So that's a brief overview of my participation at this point. I'm still actively involved with NHTSA in regards to representing them with the GVS work group. I have reapplied for the NFPA position because I was holding a enforcement position, and I've changed positions in employment, so I've reapplied and expect to be fully reinstated back in that area. This is a passion of mine since I've been involved with it. There's a rationale behind it and reasoning, and we'll continue being an advocate for safe ambulances for our industry, our patients, and our providers. So with that said, I'd like to turn this over to Coleman Sachs from the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration for some information for those who have not heard it for the first time, and those who have heard it, he will reemphasize what you've heard before. So Coleman, it's off to you.
And
thanks very much.
Hey, Coleman, before you
Go
get
ahead.
started, this is just Sue. I want to check in. I only have one person who says they can't see the screen. Is anybody else having difficulty seeing the screen? If you are, please just send us send it through a question. We'll see what we can do.
Okay, well, thanks everybody. Again, I'm Coleman Sachs. I'm Chief of the Import and Certification Division of the Office of Vehicle Safety Compliance of the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, or NHTSA. And there was a mention made that this presentation had been given before. I gave it before back in June of 2017 in Charlotte. And quite frankly, nothing has really changed from the NHTSA perspective. So if you happen to be present in Charlotte back in June of 2017, you're in for a real case of deja vu. So let's go to the first slide. So NHTSA is a small agency in the U.S. Department of Transportation. By small, we have about 500 people. We were established in 1966, around the time that Ralph Nader wrote his love sonnet to the Chevy Corvair, unsafe at any speed. There was a lot of concern at the time with vehicle safety. Highway fatalities were at record highs. There was some effort to establish some kind of national standards and somehow rein that in as part of the LBJ Great Society program. If you ever go to the LBJ library down in Austin, Texas, you'll see a picture of LBJ signing the National Traffic and Motor Vehicle Safety Act of 1966, which established our agency. And our mission is to improve safety on the nation's highways and reduce fatalities and injuries associated with vehicle crashes. We like to use the word crash. We don't use the word accident. We like to say a vehicle can be designed in such a way to minimize the consequences of a crash. We can instill proper behaviors in drivers so that they avoid dangerous situations. So we like to say a crash is no accident. One of our important functions is to issue the Federal Motor Vehicle Safety Standards. These prescribe minimum safety performance requirements for motor vehicles and for certain items of motor vehicle equipment. They're all found in 49 CFR Part 571. Each is numbered. For example, the granddaddy of all standards is Standard 208, occupant crash protection. That's the standard that requires the vehicle to be equipped with airbags and seat belts. And you'll find that in 49 CFR 571.208. There are about 64 standards in all. 49 are vehicle standards, that is, the manufacturer of the vehicle certifies the vehicle's compliance, and about 15 are equipment standards that apply to such items as tires, rims, brake hoses, brake fluid, seatbelt assemblies, lighting equipment, and glazing. I want you to get the understanding then up front that we basically have an honor system that we're operating under, in which manufacturers are certifying the compliance of their products to our standards. We all have a similar objective, that is to increase safety for motorists and highway users in this country, and manufacturers, including final stage manufacturers, have a very important role to play, and they do so in large measure by ensuring that the vehicles that they manufacture comply with our standards, and they certify them to those standards. Okay, next slide, please. There's one statute that we have that kind of rules the show as far as manufacturing and offering for sale non-conforming or non-compliant vehicles or equipment. That's 49 U.S.C. 30112A, that provides no person shall manufacture for sale, sell, offer for sale, introduce or deliver for introduction to interstate commerce or import in the United States any motor vehicle or motor vehicle equipment manufactured on or after the date the applicable standard takes effect, unless the vehicle or equipment complies with the standard and is covered by a manufacturer's certificate of compliance issued under 49 U.S.C. 30115. Next slide, please. So 30115 in turn requires a motor vehicle to be certified to the standards by permanently affixing a tag or label to the vehicle by the time of its delivery to a distributor or dealer. Okay, next slide. So is an ambulance body remounter a manufacturer? The answer to that question is yes. NHTSA's regulations at 49 CFR 571.7E provide that when a new cab is used in the assembly of a truck, the truck will be considered newly manufactured for the purpose of the National Traffic Motor Vehicle Safety Act and the Federal Motor Vehicle Safety Standards, unless the engine, transmission, and drive axles, as a minimum of the assembled vehicle, are not new, and at least two of these components are taken from the same donor vehicle. Okay, next slide. So what kind of a manufacturer is an ambulance body remounter? Well, they're final stage manufacturers. Our regulations at 49 CFR 567.3 define a chassis cab as an incomplete vehicle with a completed occupant compartment that requires only the addition of cargo carrying, work performing, or load bearing components to perform its intended function. The same regulations define a final stage manufacturer as a person who performs such manufacturing operations on an incomplete vehicle that becomes a completed vehicle, and a completed vehicle is defined as a vehicle that requires no further manufacturing operations to perform its intended function. Okay, next slide. Do ambulance body remounters have certification and other responsibilities under NHTSA's regulation? Well, the answer to that question as well is yes. As a final stage manufacturer, an ambulance body remounter assumes legal responsibility for all certification-related duties and liabilities under the Vehicle Safety Act, except to the extent the incomplete vehicle manufacturer or an intermediate manufacturer has provided equipment subject to a safety standard or expressly assumed responsibility for standards related to systems and components supplied, and except to the extent that the final stage manufacturer completed the vehicle in accordance with the prior manufacturer's incomplete vehicle document, or IVD, or any addendum to that document. And these requirements are found in our regulations at 49 Code of Federal Regulations, section 567.5D. Next slide, please. Must an ambulance body remounter affix a certification label to the completed vehicle? Again, the answer to that question is yes. As a final stage manufacturer, an ambulance body remounter must affix a certification label to each vehicle in a manner that does not obscure the labels affixed by previous stage manufacturers, and it has to contain the following statements: the name of the final stage manufacturer, preceded by the words manufactured by or MFD by, month and year in which the final stage manufacturer is completed, spelled out as either June 2000 or expressed in numerals such as 6/00. They have to specify the gross vehicle weight rating, followed by the appropriate value in kilograms and pounds, which shall not be less than the sum of the unloaded vehicle weight, the rated cargo load, and 150 pounds times the number of the vehicle's designated seating positions. Next slide, please. The label also has to have the gross axle weight rating, followed by the appropriate value in kilograms and pounds for each axle identified in order from front to rear, e.g. front, first, intermediate, second, intermediate, etc. Example, there's an example set forth in the slide. One of the following alternative certification statements must also be on the label. This vehicle conforms to all applicable federal motor vehicle safety standards in effect in a specified month and year. Or this vehicle has been completed in accordance with the prior manufacturer's IVD where applicable. This vehicle conforms to all applicable federal motor vehicle safety standards in effect in a specified month and year. Next slide. Alternate statements are this vehicle has been completed in accordance with the prior manufacturer's IVD where applicable, except for, then you insert the FMVSS that has not been completed in accordance with. This vehicle conforms to all applicable FMVSS in effect in a specified month and year. And the date shown in the above statement shall not be earlier than the manufacturing date provided by the incomplete or intermediate stage manufacturer and not later than the date of completion of the final stage manufacture. The certification labels also identify the vehicle's vehicle identification number or VIN and the vehicle's type classification, such as truck. Ambulance is not an acceptable type classification. It must be a type classification that's subject to the federal motor vehicle safety standards. Those are limited to passenger cars, multi-purpose passenger vehicles, buses, trucks, motorcycles, trailers, or low-speed vehicles. So I think the most appropriate one for an ambulance is truck, although I guess it's possible that it will also be certified as multi-purpose passenger vehicles. Okay, next slide. Here's an example of the certification label. My hat goes off to some member of the group out there who I purloined this from, but this is what the final stage manufacturer's label looks like. It has all the elements we just described in the previous slides. Okay, next slide, please. Certification is performed by the manufacturer and not by NHTSA. That is, we have no type approval process in this country as there is in the rest of the world, all other countries, but for Canada. In every other country, a manufacturer provides a vehicle or equipment item to a government test laboratory to be tested to the government standards, and the government is in fact providing the certification. Here we throw the responsibility on the manufacturer through our self-certification process. As I indicated, Sachs certification is shown by a label permanently affixed to the vehicle in a prescribed location that identifies the manufacturer, the date of manufacture, and the vehicle type, and states the vehicle complies with all applicable federal motor vehicle safety standards, in effect with the date of manufacture shown above. Next slide, please. So the location of the label is important. Regulations prescribe where the label must be affixed. It's important for local law enforcement to know, for Customs and Border Protection to know. The label has to be affixed to either the hinge pillar, door latch post, or door edge that meets the door latch post next to the driver's seating position, or if none of these locations is practicable, the left side of the instrument panel. If that location is also not practicable, then it should be affixed to the inward-facing surface of the door next to the driver's seating position. If that too is not practicable, the manufacturer has to provide notification to NHTSA with a suggested alternative location. And those regulations are found in 49 CFR 567.4C. Next slide. The certification. So are we just content as a manufacturer merely slap the certification label on the vehicle and walk away and NHTSA has no other concerns? Well, that's not quite the case. The manufacturer has a duty to exercise reasonable care in certifying a vehicle to an applicable standard. We run our own compliance testing program. Every 5 years, we tend to test whatever is most popular out there, anything introduced by a new entrant manufacturer, something that might pose particular concerns. And if we should suspect a non-compliance as a result of this testing, we'll ask the manufacturer to demonstrate how to exercise reasonable care. We could also learn of the potential non-compliance from complaints filed with our safercar.com website or through owners filing vehicle owner questionnaires. There are tests that are prescribed in many of our standards. These are NHTSA's notice to the world of what we will do to determine compliance. The manufacturer is free to demonstrate compliance by other means, such as engineering analysis, computer modeling, and the like, so long as the manufacturer can prove to us that it exercised reasonable care in making its certification. Next slide, please. If manufacturer fails to demonstrate that it exercised reasonable care in certifying the vehicle or equipment to the standard, it is subject to civil penalties. Congress recently tripled these penalties to $21,000 per violation, up to a maximum civil penalty of $105 million for a related series of violations, with a separate violation existing with respect to each vehicle or equipment item that does not comply, and with respect to each non-compliance in each vehicle or equipment item. So the amount of the civil penalty can quickly accumulate, particularly under the new limits that Congress has given us. Okay, next slide. So in addition to affixing the certification label, there are certain procedural requirements that a manufacturer must meet. One, it has to identify itself and its products to NHTSA under our regulations in 49 CFR Part 566, manufacturer identification. We have a new website where that is done. It is at VPIC, Victor Paul Eileen Charlie.NHTSA, NHTSA.dot.gov. We have a new electronic database for manufacturers to use in providing us with manufacturer identifying information. And I guess you have it right here. It's submitted to and published on our website at the one just provided. For further information, you can call the website managers at 1-888-399-3277 or visit our website at manufacturerinfo@dot.gov. Okay, next slide. Oh, that's it. Well, did I make it in under 20 minutes?
You did a great job, Coleman. I'm sure there'll be some questions for you at the end. Thank you so much.
How many minutes was it then?
I didn't time it exactly, but we're at 12:27, so you're doing great. And next up is Ken Holland with NFPA 1917. Again, we'll have questions at the end, and just for your information, two things. One, this is being recorded, so this will be made available on the NHTSA website, and there is a handout in the handout section of your control panel that has all of the slides included. Okay, go ahead, Ken.
Thank you very much. So yes, good morning or good afternoon now. My name is Ken Holland. I'm a senior specialist with the NFPA, or the National Fire Protection Association. I've been with the NFPA for just over 10 years now, and one of my responsibilities with the NFPA is working as a liaison with the NFPA Technical Committee on Automotive Ambulances, and that committee is responsible for NFPA 1917, which is the standard on automotive ambulances. A bit about the NFPA. The NFPA is a ANSI accredited standards developing organization. We were established back in 1896, so we've been around for a little while, and we're also a nonprofit organization. We have over 300 voluntary consensus standards covering a wide variety of subjects such as the National Electric Code, emergency medical services, apparatus, qualifications. We also have we're developing a project or a document on active shooter and hostile events, NFPA 3000, and John Montes, the staff liaison for that, is doing a presentation down at EMS today. And we also have another project going on, NFPA 2400, which is on the use of drones. Our standards are developed by technical committees that are balanced by 9 interest categories, and the technical committees serve as the principal consensus bodies responsible for the development and revision of the NFPA standard. So it's not the NFPA that writes the standard, it is the technical committees that are comprised of various members from those from 9 interest categories. The technical committees have a typical size of 30. Some are larger than 30. Some are smaller than 30, but they do have to maintain a balance. All of our NFPA standards do go through a revision cycle, and it's typically 3 or 5-year revision cycles, and NFPA 1917 happens to be on a 3-year revision cycle, and that's due in part because of the changes, the rapid changes in the industry. And our revision cycles usually take about 18 months to up to 2 years. So that can be a long time to have changes incorporated into a document. So we've opted to go with the 3-year revision cycle for 1917. There are 4 steps in the process in revising our documents. There's a public input stage, a public comment stage. There is the our tech session, which is where people can voice their opinions and concerns about documents. And then there's the Standards Council action. And our Standards Council, they will address appeals to our standards, or they will issue said standards. Now, for 1917, the current edition of 1917 is the 2016 edition. Revisions on the 2016 edition for what will be the 2019 edition began back in late 2016. So it's been about 2 years. The committee's been made many changes to the 2016 edition for the 2019 edition, including requirements on remounts, which is obviously part of why we're on this panel today. As you can see on the slide, the committee has finished all of its work for the 2019 edition of 1917. Many of the changes for the edition were made. There were many changes made, including new material on remounts. And this new material comes out of an increase in the use of remounts to address the lack of standards on these remounts. Interestingly enough, yesterday was the cutoff dates for the last stage of our process, which is submitting a NITMAM, and that's basically an appeal to the issuance of the document. 1917 did not receive any, so that means that the document could be issued, will be issued on or before April 29th of 2018, and it will carry a 2019 edition, and it will have the January 1st, 2019 effective date. So now on 1917, as it relates to remounts, what the committee did is they included a brand new chapter, which includes the requirements for remounts, and they included a new annex, which is some suggested material, some guidelines for remounts. Now, just to be clear, there's a difference between chapters within the main body of our standards. Those are filled with requirements. Those items listed in the chapters are requirements and are accompanied with a shall statement, so they shall be met. The material in our annexes are not part of the requirements and are just for guidelines or recommendations to assist the end user in the use and adoption of our standards, or to the relativity of the subject matter that the annex is relating to. Some of the material that the committee included in what will be a new Chapter 10 on remounts. Again, these are the requirements. They set an applicability date for remounts in the use of the next edition in 1917, and it talks about that it's for automotive ambulances that are contracted after January 1st, 2019, and not applicable to remounts prior to that date. But it also says that there's nothing that would prohibit the authority having jurisdiction of the end user to voluntarily apply the chapter to previously contracted ambulance that are done prior to 2019. But the intent of the chapter is to only apply to remounts contracted after January 1st, 2019. It's also, the chapter is not intended to be applied retroactively, so the intent is to not apply the requirements in Chapter 10 to an ambulance that might have been contracted to the 2016 edition of 1917 or the 2013 edition, or any of the other, the GSA's document or CASA's document with regards to new ambulances. The intent was not to make it retroactive. It also talks about some general requirements with regards to the patient compartment and how it's to be mounted in accordance with the chassis manufacturer, and also to make sure that the components, the upgraded components, are compatible with the new vehicle. And it also points back to NHTSA requirements that have to be met that are applicable to the final stage vehicle manufacturer. And Coleman did a great job discussing what those requirements are from NHTSA. So those still have to be met in addition to what's in 1917 Chapter 10. There's also some discussion points on what's the responsibility of the purchaser and what the purchaser needs to do when working with the contractor. And that's, again, with regards to the amount of equipment and personnel that are going to be on the vehicle, and to make sure that those weights are taken into account for other components of the vehicle. It also talks about some of the responsibilities of the contractor and what the contractor has to do and what they need to meet in order to ensure that the ambulance is safe, as well as meeting the needs of the purchaser. And there's also some discussion points upon weight distributions and how to address the longitudinal and lateral weight distributions, and also the ambulance components. And those components that are installed have to be in accordance with the manufacturer's published installation instructions, or they're otherwise approved by a component manufacturer. And then it also discusses medical devices in the that are going to be used in the ambulance, the remounted ambulances, and that they have to meet the U.S. Food and Drug Administration requirements as applicable. One thing that has come up, and I want to try to clear up as best I can, is there are some new SAE testing standards that have been published, and while they have not been spelled out as needing to be applied to in the new Chapter 10 for remounts, I just want to note that if you look at the 1917 Chapter 1.3.1, it states that the next edition applies to those new ambulances and remounts contracted after January 1st, 2019, which I've already stated. And then again in Section 1.4, it states that the document shall not be applied retroactively. Again, that's to ensure that older ambulances that were built prior to these SAE testing standards, it might not be feasible that these new test standards could even be applied to or used in remount. So they wanted to make sure that the committee wanted to make sure that there was no confusion about applying these new SAE test standards to older vehicles, older remounts. So in any ambulance, a new or a remount that's contracted before January 1st, 2019, they would not fall under the new requirements for the next edition of 1917. But Chapter 10.1.1 also states that the requirements are applicable to only those contracted after that date. However, the purchaser or HJ can voluntarily apply those requirements if they so choose to a remount. But that's up to the HJ to determine or decide. And there's nothing in the document that prohibits them from doing so. Also, if you look at Chapter 2 of the next edition, what will be the next edition of 1917, it does include those new SAE testing standards, and those are applicable to everything in the document where applicable. So you would need to use those SAE testing standards where they could be used appropriately within the standard. But again, where there's no retroactivity, it's not intended to be applied retroactively. It would be just for those vehicles contracted after January 1st. Now, if you look at the Annex B of the new document, which I'll discuss briefly, it does specifically spell out those new SAE test standards. And it says that, that's a recommended critical upgrade, that ambulance owners should consider modifying or upgrading equipment to meet the following performance and testing criteria. So it does spell out those 4 SAE test standards, J3026, J3027, J3043, and J3058. So while not required, it's recommended that the ambulance owner, when doing a remount, use those. But again, they're not required to. If it's again, and that would be those that are contracted before that date, but anything contracted after that date, those standards would definitely apply to. So again, in the annex, again, these are not part of the requirements. The committee decided to spell out, they try to set a date of where ambulance patient compartments that were not originally built in 1917, the CAS GVS version 1.0, or the GSA's KKK 1822 version E. Those ambulances, or if they weren't built to those documents or later, they should not be remounted. But again, that's not part of the requirements. It's just a suggestion from the committee that those older vehicles not built to those original standards, don't be remounted. There's an in-depth discussion about evaluation of ambulances and making sure that it's feasible to do a remount of an ambulance, be cost-effective and is increasing the safety of the vehicle for the occupants and the end users. They go in to discuss possible upgrades for remounts, and they also, as I said, there's some recommended critical upgrades. They also talk about how to address recalls, as well as some external requirements, previous standards that may have been met, and then states. One thing is they need to check with the individual states to make sure that that vehicle can get licensed in that individual state. So as Michael was saying, in Virginia, which is a Commonwealth, excuse me, Michael, it has to be, you have to make sure that, you're operating within their laws and rules. And you'd hate to see this work get done and then you try to, get it licensed, the vehicle licensed, and for the state of the Commonwealth, it can't be done. And the committee also developed quite a lengthy checklist. I'm not going to go through all of the items because there's about 50 of them. But so that's some of the work that the committee's done on remounts. As I said, the committee has finished their work on the next edition of 1917, which will be ANSI accredited, and as I know, will be the only ANSI accredited ambulance standard out there to address new ambulances as well as remounts, and that should be issued on or before April 29th of 2018. And with that, I think I certainly was within my time, but I appreciate the opportunity to be able to be a part of this webinar, as well as being a panelist with these fine gentlemen and women that to help set this up. Again, thank you very much.
Great, thanks, Ken. And again, I see some questions that are coming in. We're going to be holding those till the end, so please continue to submit. Again, this webinar is recorded, and I'd like to turn it over now to our last but not least speaker before questions and answers, Mark Van Arman from CAS. He's going to talk again about the ground vehicle standard for ambulances, version 1.0.
Yeah, many thanks to NHTSA for hosting this webinar. This is a critical issue and probably one of the toughest things we're dealing with, and we're pleased to have the opportunity to go through and give everyone a position. Rachel, if you can just click twice there, if you would, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the background of CAS, just very briefly, who we are and what our ground vehicle standard is. As you may probably very well know, a commission accreditation for ambulance services accredits basically operating services, ambulance service providers, both public and private, throughout the country. We've been doing it for a long time and are actually at the gold standard of ambulance operations and exceed all the state requirements from state to state, and accredited services all over the country are doing very well, operating under our standards. We're very proud of the success of the operation. One thing to make clear, the accreditation standard for ambulance services does not require compliance to the GVS document, the ground vehicle standard. These are actually two separate programs. So accrediting an ambulance service versus a ground vehicle standard certified vehicle, two separate programs, both addressed by CAS, both presented by CAS and owned by CAS, but they are two separate programs. Rachel, next please. The ground vehicle standard is the design for new ambulances. It's a minimum standard. It is not a specification, but basically a minimum standard. It's version 1.0 has been in effect since July 2016. Minimum standards, performance, and the criteria for the design of new vehicles tries to provide some standardization. When built to the standard, the vehicle will have a certification sticker. Now, I want to clarify one thing that Coleman said. Coleman talked about certification stickers, which we're all very familiar with. That is for the Federal Motor Vehicle Safety Standards. So basically, for the chassis and applicable equipment being certified to the FMVSS, a completely different thing than certification to an ambulance standard. So you're probably very familiar with the KKK standard certification and now the GVS certification and or the NFPA certification, two separate things. So a vehicle as completed would require both of them. It would require initially, as a minimum, compliance to the Federal Motor Vehicle Safety Standard, and that's whether it's an ambulance, a dump truck, an RV, a fire truck, it doesn't make any difference. All the vehicles on the road have to be certified to FMVSS. Now when we talk about the ambulance side, the verification certification sticker that's put on there as, again, KKK or GVS or NFPA verifies compliance to the ambulance standard. That's a completely different thing, but complements the FMVSS sticker, and it's part of the second stage process where the vehicle is converted into an ambulance. I would make the comment that both the CAS accreditation and the GVS standard follow the same process for standard development through ANSI. And again, the GVS standard completely separate from the CAS standard, and the two of them are not related, but as a requirement for either or. Our website, Ground Vehicle Standard, has a lot of data on, including the standard, which can be downloaded at no charge. Next. The foundation of the GVS document, which again has been in effect now since 2016, is the GSA Federal KKK spec. We've had many states already adopt the GSA document, the CAS GVS document. Some states, in addition to the KKK or the NFPA, and there are other states certainly looking at this. And there's one particular state of North Carolina, which we're very proud has never had an ambulance standard up till now, has now adopted the CAS GVS and the NFPA both as a new standard. So effective July 1 of this year, that's a requirement in the state of North Carolina. Our standard is applicable to new production vehicles only. It's always a frequently asked question, not required for existing fleet vehicles. In other words, you don't have to go back and upfit your fleet, but new vehicles that you receive or certify after a specific date need to be compliant to the standard. All the current chassis offerings are included certain quality criteria, the new NIOSH safety standards, and purchaser flexibility, all been built into our new vehicle standard. So that's with the new vehicles. That's the CAS version 1.0. Next, please. I want to talk about remounts here. So basically, the remounts have been around since the 70s, and I might go back that far. It's always been a thing, but it was never really became a major issue. In the last 5 to 10 years, it's grown exponentially. And that's for two reasons. Number one, we all know what's happened to budgets, Medicare reimbursement, either on the public side or the private side. Times are tough. So using the existing module with a new chassis and whatever renovation or upfit you desire certainly reduces the cost. But secondarily, no obligation to meet any ambulance standard. So this is the downside. So essentially, what has happened here is that people are going to remount because they're sort of under the radar, so to speak. There are no requirements for remounters or remounts, and therefore there's a serious financial gain there. That's probably not the right answer. I'm sympathetic with the budget side, using the existing module to reduce the cost. That's good. However, we think that not having any standards for remounts is not necessarily a good thing, and that's why our stakeholders and the Commission has agreed to address this issue and develop standards for remounts. Currently, and I would tell you, going back 70s or 80s, there were a couple hundred remounts a year. Now, and we recently did a survey industry-wide. There was no data. And if I could give you on scale here, there's about 6,000 new ambulances built a year in between the United States and Canada. And that's a number that is known by the A&D. We calculate those numbers annually, new ambulance production. No one had any idea how many remounts that were done. So we collected data earlier in 2016, and we found that there are far more remounters than new ambulance builders. And about 20% of all total vehicles are remounts now. You've got about 1,500 plus remounts being done a year. Again, exempt from most regulations and no standards required. Products range from simple remounts, take the box off and put it on a new chassis and drive it off the lot, to a complete rebuild and reconfiguration. That would be changing from a Ford to Chevrolet, changing from a Type 3 to a Type 1, changing from a medium duty to a Type 1, so on and so forth. Moving seats, moving seat belts, reconfiguring interiors, things of that nature. And as you can well imagine, with no standards, quality of product quality varies widely depending on who's doing it. It's very subjective, and there's some Class A guys, and there's probably some Class C and D folks out there. There's a wide range of remounts, and it was someone said earlier, there is shade tree mechanics doing this with a tree. I've actually seen it myself. We've seen ambulances being rebuilt in Mako Auto Body. Not to take anything anyway from those guys, but that's probably not appropriate for the life-saving product we're dealing with, and it is not necessarily the best situation. Next, please. There are three kinds of remounters as we have gone through our process. Independent remounters, that's certainly the largest group. There are in excess of 20 of those in the United States. 20 plus, and I don't even know that we know exactly how many there are. There are a lot of final stage ambulance manufacturers defined as FSAMs under the guidelines who are also doing remounts. Not all of them are, but many of them are. And we have a group of EMS providers doing their own in-house remounts. That's becoming more and more popular, particularly with the larger private operators for the most part, and public operators who are doing it in-house. And so we have all three of those categories of folks doing remounts at this time. Next, please. So on this, many of these remounters that we've found in our survey were unaware of the NHTSA FMVSS requirements that Coleman talked about earlier. Certainly the new ambulance builders they live with this. Every vehicle they build has been certified in accordance with the FMVSS. However, we found that many of the particularly independent remounters were not aware they had to meet these federal standards, were not aware they had to register with NHTSA as a builder, were not aware they had to certify the vehicle as a final stage manufacturer. And I can tell you, that is not happening yet all the way across the industry. There's certainly folks who are now aware and hopefully reacting to that. But I will tell you that was not always required or known by everybody. So a remounter today has no requirement for any credentials or no operating requirements whatsoever versus a new ambulance builder who's required to do a lot of things and have a lot of things. A remounter has no testing or certification requirements. Again, a new ambulance builder has to do all of these things where a remounter does not. And no financial or insurance requirements. Give us something basic like garage keepers policy, product liability, a huge, huge issue. We see a lot of ambulance remounters who come in business and have actually gone out. There is a substantial attrition rate. One of the largest remounters in the country went out last year. There's no barriers to entry. There's nothing to stop a remounter from coming in, setting up shop, and getting into the business. So basically what's happening is that we are regulating an unregulated industry. It's not very popular with all. I certainly think it's the right thing to do. And it is happening, and the momentum is very significant. Next, please. When I talk about our standard for remounts, we held a forum in June. You heard Coleman refer to that earlier. Coleman was there, as Mike Berg and Ken Holland. Everybody's there. We had a huge turnout. Over 175 people came to talk about remounts. It had never been done before. This group of people had never been collected. So out of that, we established a remount work group per ANSI guidelines, and CAS is an ANSI accredited standards organization, to develop a balanced work group to try to put together a standard. We're right in the middle of that process right now. So essentially, we've had 50 to 60 participants. We've already had 2 meetings. Out of that work group, there are 22 voting members, And the reason there are voting members versus letting everybody vote is to make sure the group keeps a balance. In other words, so many builders, so many remounters, so many providers, and of course we have federal partners who are engaged throughout the CAST GVS process and with this remount process as well. So we are essentially creating a remount standard draft document for permission to the CAST GVS committee later this year. That committee will be doing a review of a remount standard document. Will go out for public comment, and it will be included in our version 2.0 revision for CAST GVS that comes into play in next July 2019. So like in NFPA, our next revision will include a chapter or an annex on our remount standard. Next, please. If you want to hear more about this meeting or read about it, there was an excellent article in the August issue of GEMS following our meeting, Rethinking Remounts. It's online. It's actually in our website. So if you go to groundvehiclestandard.org, you can click on this. It gives you a lot of background, and you see Coleman's picture there. He's there along with a bunch of others who made some great presentations. It was a very intensive group, and a lot was covered during the course of the day. Next, please. So there are some critical considerations that we have to worry about here. I'll tell you that I personally have been involved in the KKK process all the way since the early 80s and know it well. I've been certainly involved in the CAST GVS process as many other people. I will tell you that the remount process is infinitely more difficult than developing a new vehicle standard. There's a tremendous amount of moving parts, and it is a variety of different things that hit you, and there's many things that surprise us that we have to deal with, some of which were known, some of which were not known. But there's considerations that you have to look at to say, as Coleman said, when a new cab is used in a truck, it's a new truck. So we now have Federal Motor Vehicle Safety Compliance issues with certification issues with that. That's well and good. But we also have remount issues with that. And I'll talk about that in just a second. But some provisions of the ambulance patient compartment are actually covered under FMVSS. So this is a consideration. So remounters are now required to comply as new vehicle manufacturers by federal law. So anybody do have to go out, register in this, and by the fact that you are a final stage vehicle manufacturer, you do have certification and verification requirements. You need to play by the law. Full compliance with all FMVSS regulations is required, no exception. I said some of these do relate to the patient compartment, and I would talk about just two, for example. There's a standard for door hardware, which is door latches and locks and hinges, and seats and belts. Both of those standards have changed in 2007, 2008, and so if you are remounting an ambulance, for example, that is older than that, you have a requirement under FMVSS to upgrade the door hardware and the seats and belts to the new standard. Now, I'm not talking to ambulance standards. I'm talking to FMVSS standards, as they are required under FMVSS compliance. This is something that was not aware by most. They were not aware that this needed to happen, but it's certainly a federal requirement. So the completed vehicle, again, has to be certified, final stage, by the remounter. Again, FMVSS requirements are relative to the date of chassis, not the date of the patient module. Truth be known, at the end of the process, the age of the patient module is irrelevant. It has no bearing on anything other than the fact it has to be updated to the new FMVSS standards, and according to how the standards process goes on ambulance side, to the ambulance standards as well, and that's all to be determined. In our standard, although I think the NFPA has already crossed that bridge and it's already taken their position on it, that is still not developed and still pending committee action on the CAST GVS side. Next, please. And here's the last but not least, and this is the big 500-pound gorilla that was laid at the meeting, laid out at the meeting, is that the ambulance certification, I'm talking again, FMVSS certification and ambulance certification, two different things, that the federal KKK Star of Life sticker that's on an ambulance that might be remounted is absolutely not transferable to a remounted ambulance. In other words, this vehicle may have been built to KKK and may have had a certification by the actual manufacturer, who may or may not be in business still, who may or may not be remounting the vehicle. that certification is not transferable to remounted ambulance. So an ambulance that's remounted and still has a sticker on it, that sticker may be there for informational purposes only, but it is not a Star of Life certified ambulance, nor is it any certified to any remount standard by virtue of the fact it's just carried over to a new chassis. Next, please. So here's the criteria we're working on for our standard, and just a list of things. I'll go through them real quick. These are basically the things that we're including in our standard. We're requiring some credentials and certifications for the remounter. That's somewhere we've never gone, even with the new vehicle standard. And I can tell you things that we develop here will go back into our new vehicle standard as well. If they're in the remount side and they're good for that, they're good for the new vehicle side. So we're creating a requirement for product and general liability coverage. Again, you get an accident, God forbid, down the road with this thing, you go back, the manufacturer's gone, there's no product liability coverage, not a good situation for anybody. Also a requirement for warranty provisions, all will be included in our standard. Compliance with FMVSS and the OEM chassis requirements, that's a minimum, that's a must and must happen. Determination of the viability and feasibility of a proposed remount. In other words, is this box worth saving? Will it go on that chassis? Is this even possible? Documentation of a process and controls may absolutely exists in new vehicle manufacturers, not necessarily in the remount side. And we think that those processes and controls should be documented. And consideration for the new SAE standards to be included in a remount. Does it require the new cop mounts, yes or no? Will it require the new safety equipment, seat belts and seats? Will it require the new equipment restraint? So again, we're still in process with that. A major issue is engineering requirements for major modifications. Move a seat here. This needs to be facing forward instead of facing backwards. I can tell you a new vehicle manufacturer cannot do that without going through a heck of a process of certification. And you may have seen new vehicle manufacturers say, I won't do that. I can't. I don't have it certified. There's not a seat available or installation available to do that. Versus a remounter who may or may not know that they have to do this. And we've seen remounts where a seat was installed over here because somebody thought it was a good idea. That's really not the way this is supposed to be done. And then weight and payload and balance analysis, a big issue. Weight and payload is a huge issue in ambulances and something we want to make sure is covered. Determination of remount applicable AMD and QC testing requirements. We do have testing requirements for new vehicles, not applicable to remounts, so we're going to see how many of those will carry over and be applicable to remounts, so we can go to in a remount standard, you should do this one, this one, this one. And documentation and record keeping, what we find is remounts, nobody knows where this box came from, who built it, how old it is, how many times it's been remounted. We're going to try to deal with that and have a standard that does accomplish those things. One more, please. This is a certification that you would see on a CAS new vehicle certified. There's there's a verification sticker that goes on the vehicle, and there's two documents. One is a vehicle compliance documentation. The other is a payload compliance. These two documents go in the manual, while the first sticker goes on the vehicle. The reason I'm showing you this is because we will have stickers and verification documentation for remounts. So it will look similar to this, but it will be a different color. So if you are remounting to the CAS GVS standard, you will see a certified CAS remount vehicle, GVS remount vehicle, by a registered remounter who is registered with CAS and has agreed to comply with the standards as dictated by the standard, and also these documents as well. Different information on them, but basically the same kind of a process. Next, please. So this is our website, groundvehiclestandard.org. A lot of this information that I told you about is here. Also a link again to the article and to several kinds of things. You'll find information on our remount work group. Our next remount work group meeting is on April 11th in Charlotte, North Carolina. We will actually produce a document there that will be handed over to the GVS committee, a draft remount standard, and it will include all the things we talked about here. So appreciate your interest, and thanks for the time, and I am good to go. Rachel, thank you.
Okay, this is, thank you, Rachel. Thank you, Mike, Coleman, Ken, and Mark. I do have, I have some questions, so I'm going to open these up and read them off. Let's see, the first one is, how does the Federal Motor Vehicle Safety Standard differ from NFPA 1917 and CAS GVS? And so that's kind of sort of to the whole group. I don't know exactly who wants to take that one. Maybe Coleman or Mark?
Yeah, fine. The FMVSS has nothing to do with the patient compartment and conversion. Basically, it is a standard for motor vehicles, and I take that back a little bit. There's a couple things, as I said, door hardware and seats that do require. But the certification of the vehicle as being compliant with the Federal Motor Vehicle Safety Standards, windshield, wipers, headlights, steering, et cetera, whereas GVS and NFPA bumper-to-bumper ambulance standards, and I'll include Triple K in that conversation, are certification to the ambulance standard, not to the chassis standard or compliance with the federal NHTSA rules. So two separate and distinct things, one chassis motor vehicle side, one ambulance side.
And let me add to that, Mark, if I may, because it's possible that the FMVSS compliance issues could be presented through remounting. The FMVSS regulate lighting equipment, conspicuity requirements. If there's any lighting equipment on a remounted ambulance, the remount would have to comply with the lighting standard as it existed at the time of the remount, or at the time, date between the manufacture of the incomplete vehicle and the date of the remount. So there are other things, as you mentioned. There are requirements for seat anchorages, seat belt anchorages that are FMVSS related. So it could well be that there are, in door locks, door retention components, there are, as I indicated, 64 standards in all. Over 40 of them are vehicle standards. We put out a very nice handbook for new vehicle manufacturers. You can find on that VPIC website. At the back of the manual is a nice table that identifies by vehicle type all the standards that apply. I would encourage anyone to download that, take a look at the table, and you could appreciate the full breadth of standards that apply even to something like a remounted ambulance. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you.
Thank you. I just want to add too that anything that's in the NFPA 1917 with regards to new ambulances or remounts, whatever's in 1917, it does not supersede anything that any FMVSS, any of those requirements or any other federal government requirements. So nothing in 1917 would supersede what FMVSS already requires.
Great, thank you. And that question was from Romy Duckworth. So moving on to the next question from Nicole Babb for Coleman. Do the remounted vehicles get a new VIN number?
No, they don't. The VIN is assigned by the incomplete vehicle manufacturer, by the chassis cab manufacturer. There is no way that a final stage manufacturer could be assigning its own VIN. So, the vehicle keeps the VIN assigned by the chassis cab manufacturer.
Great, thank you. The next question is from Montgomery Nye. If NHTSA says remounts are considered new vehicles, and new vehicles must meet current safety standards, but GVS says it does not apply to remounts, which one rules? I think, Mark, you've kind of already gotten to that, but if I'm just going to redirect this question to you.
Well, we have standards and we have standards. Unfortunately, we have two different processes going on with the same name. Federal Motor Vehicle Safety Standards are requirements for the chassis itself, whereas the GVS requirements, be it for a new vehicle or a remount, are ambulance specific. We do require compliance to the FMVSS. In our document, it says you will comply with FMVSS. That's rule number one. But the other rules are ambulance specific and are specific ambulance components, the other standards being the SAE standards. So when you get into the cop mount or the equipment retention or things of that nature that are ambulance specific, those are the things that are covered under GVS and NFPA and Triple K. We don't talk about headlights and turn signals and things of that nature. That's all on the FMVSS side.
Great, thanks, Mark. And our next question is from Corey Bernardino. And it says, is there a consideration to how many times a module can be rechassied in the CAS GVS draft?
You know, we did not have not. That's been highly debated. To my knowledge, the record in the industry is a unit that's actually on its 5th chassis, and there is no aging that's been specified. It's very difficult, as these vehicles are not identified as to how old they are, who built them. I mean, basically on a modular body, it doesn't say anything. So we're struggling with a way to identify that. I think one thing we'll do going forward is require a metal plate inside a vehicle stating the manufacturer and when the vehicle was built. Going backwards, you don't know where this thing came from or how long it's been around and how many times it has in fact been remounted. So we're struggling with that issue. We think it's a need. We haven't really figured out how to tackle that yet.
Great, thanks, Mark. All right, our next question is from Philip Holt. There's National Highway Traffic Safety Administration DOT 571.3. However, for trucks and multipurpose passenger vehicles with a gross vehicle weight rating greater than 10,000 pounds, police vehicles are defined. Just make sure defined in S7 of FMVSS number 208, firefighting vehicles, ambulances, and motorhomes, a seating location that is labeled in accordance with S4.4 of FMVSS number 207. That will not be considered a designated seating position. Were ambulances not considered exempt?
Is this a question for me?
I think so. And, you know, if you'd like, I can have Philip. Philip, you can unmute
Yes,
yourself.
the questioners send that to me. I will refer it to the safety compliance engineers for the standards involved, and we'll get the questioner a response. Okay?
Okay.
That's a very detailed question we've got there.
Okay.
Maybe we'll hire the questioner.
All right. And it's Philip Holt. And Philip, just stay on the line as we get to the. Oh, actually, I have your email address in the registrants, so I will connect you with Coleman, and we'll get that answered. Thanks. Our next is, in order to certify a remounted ambulance to the Triple K Star of Life certification, do the current Triple K specifications need to be met, including CN8 and CN10? And that's for anybody who'd like to take that.
Yeah, this is Mark. The certification process is a process, it's a little bit detailed, but to certify an ambulance builder would go out and build one, let's say a Ford Type 3, build one, and then he takes it to a certification lab, and the certification lab tests it. Some of that testing is destructive. It is not intended to be a production vehicle, not unlike when you buy a Ford. It's already been tested and certified to a standard or Chevy or whatever. And again, that certification document is given to a manufacturer. He has 5 years to build every ambulance that is built just like that. He can put a sticker on it and say it's certified. It's not intended to be for a single vehicle. So there's no methodology for testing. This remount has to be certified. Some of the testing is destructive, crushing the box, breaking the cabinets, pulling the seats out of the floor. So you can't certify a single vehicle. So this is one of those moving parts that I talked about. You cannot certify a single vehicle. Really, the only people who could come close to certifying a single vehicle would be the original person that built it. And then, some of that stuff would not be compliant up to date. He could only certify it to the date, the age in which it was built. So it becomes very, very complicated. So the answer is, and this is a little bit contrary to Mike's situation there in Virginia, where they said remounts have to be certified to the brand new standard. That is easier said than done, and it's not really a methodology to do that at this stage of the game. So it becomes a bit of a paradox.
If I could add, Mark, your answer is right on spot, but I would also point the question to the state in which the vehicle is licensed or permitted, and they have to look at how the rules are written in that state. For example, first of all, the Triple K does not address remounts. So they're only talking about purchase specifications for new vehicles. However, if the state rules indicate that they have to meet current specifications, and that's what they need to do. So the answer to your question is a little bit longer, but I would refer you back to your state to make sure what your state rules indicate with regards to how that vehicle can be permitted and what standard it must meet.
Great, thank you. And that was from Robert Boney. Our next question is from Mario Mendez. Who decided the Star of Life is not transferable? Is that a Coleman question?
It is not. It has
Okay.
nothing to do with motor vehicle safety standard.
Sorry, just
I will say, Sue, at our meeting in June, John McDonald, representing GSA, was there. Star of Life is actually a GSA trademark owned by the DOT. They're the ones that administer the program. John made a statement at the meeting, and I believe it's even noted in the article that came from him as well.
You are correct, Mark.
great. Thanks so much for that, Mario. And our last question, is there an easy way to tell when a vehicle has been remounted by inspection? This is another question from Nicole Babb.
I can tell you, this is Mike, I can tell you from an inspector standpoint, and I'll use Virginia as the example. When we go look at a vehicle, first and foremost, it's going to have the certification sticker, whether it's a GVS or it's an FPA or it's the Star of Life. The VIN number that's on that sticker has to match the VIN number that's on the chassis. And I can tell you, we have run across vehicles where the VIN numbers just did not match. And so that's one surefire way from an inspector standpoint to make a determination. A lot of it is common knowledge, but from a, if you will, a scientific standpoint, the VIN number on the ambulance, whether it's a Star Life, a GVS, or an NFPA sticker, doesn't match what's on the chassis. That's a good clue that it's been a remount.
Great, thanks, Mike. And that is our last question, unless anybody, we're 2 minutes over. And again, this call is recorded. This webinar has been recorded, so we'll be posting that. If there's another question, I'm sure our panel would be happy to take it. If not, we can move to wrap up. Seeing no hands raised, again, on behalf of the National Association of State EMS Officials and the Agency and Vehicle Licensure Committee, I'd like to thank all of you who joined us today. And you're obviously you have an interest. This is, as you can see, an interesting and not just an exciting, but an important topic in the nation of emergency medical services. So we're happy to have this conversation, and really I'd like to extend my deep appreciation to the members of the panel, our subject matter experts who have been preparing for this call for the last few months, and you guys did a great job today. Thank you all for the questions. Any of our panelists have any final words as we move on in our Thursday?
I would encourage people who have questions to ask. There's a lot of misinformation that's circulating. That often happens when the unknown is out there. This is new territory. So please, if you have questions, reach out to Ken, reach out to Coleman, myself, Mark, John McDonald for that matter. We're happy to answer those questions. We work closely together in various venues on a frequent basis. So we share that information. So, and get involved. We want you to get involved.
Yeah, this is Mark. Our CASH GVS work group on remounts will convene in Charlotte, North Carolina on April the 11th for a final meeting to develop the draft standard. The meeting is open to anyone, and we would be glad to have you if you're interested in the process. Once we get that standard wrapped up through the course of the year, it will be out for public comment after January 1. It'll be on our website, and that allows anybody who has any interest at all to read the standard and comment publicly, and then we will address all of those concerns. So that's in process, and again, that meeting is open to anyone who has interest.
This is Ken. I just want to again thank you for the opportunity to be able to be a part of this panel and give the NFPA perspective as it relates to remounts and to a little bit new ambulances. As I said, 1917 should the 2019 edition should be issued very shortly. And again, you can check out our website, which was the link is included on that slide about any future meetings coming up. The committee won't be meeting for a little while now since the new edition will be out. But again, if you have any questions, you can go to that website and email me directly, and I'd be more than happy to provide whatever information I can. Again, thank you very much.
And I wish to thank you as well for giving the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration an opportunity to participate. I hope I've been able to impress upon all the participants the importance of certifying products that we regulate to our standards. There's a great public interest in that, that of highway safety. The need to certify applies to anyone who's manufacturing something for introduction into interstate commerce. Introduction to interstate commerce means operating something on public roads. So even if you're doing a remount for yourself, the certification responsibilities to the FMVSS do apply to you. Thank you very much.
Great. Two more things. There are two new questions that have come in. I'm actually, because we're over time, I'm going to direct those to the panel in email and get back to both Bob Hasselman and John Guigan. Sorry, I just didn't do well with your last name, but I'll make sure you get your questions answered. And Heather, I'll get you the email addresses from the panelists. Each of the panelists that represent different organizations and associations, and I just want to remind folks too that your state EMS office, the authority that has the primary oversight for EMS in your state, is also a resource on this topic and connects and works with all of these groups. It's a great partnership. So thanks again. Again, those of you who have outstanding questions, I'll take care of this right now. And panelists, great job today. Thank you.
Thanks to everybody.
All right, Rachel, shut her down. She has to control the webinar on her end. Sorry, everybody heard that. Control, shut down.
All right, I'm signing off. Thank you, Sue.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks,
Great job.
Rachel.
Thank you. Safe travels, Sue.
Great. Thank you.